Millionaire disguised as a beggar makes a request at his restaurant and is shocked to hear the women behind him. William Thompson gazed at the city from the height of his office on the 20th floor of the most luxurious commercial building in Chicago. The Pinnacle, his most prized creation, was celebrating its 15th anniversary that day. The glass walls reflected the golden glow of the sunset as he contemplated the culinary empire he had built over the years. His phone vibrated for the 10th time that hour. Another message from his daughter, Emily, reminding him of the anniversary dinner she had organized to celebrate the Pinnacle's success. William sighed, slipping the device into the pocket of his custom-made Italian suit. Something was bothering him, a sense of emptiness that not even the 5-star reviews in top culinary magazines could fill. The restaurant was always packed. Reservations were made months in advance and the reviews couldn't be better. Yet William felt increasingly disconnected from his own creation. The waiters' smiles seemed automatic, the chatter of the customers sounded artificial, and even the aroma from the kitchen had lost that special touch that had once made him fall in love with gastronomy. That morning, during a meeting with his executives, something caught his attention. One of the managers casually mentioned that the chef, Richard, was experimenting with new suppliers for some specific ingredients. The comment might have gone unnoticed, but William knew every detail of his menu, every supplier carefully selected over the years. Why change something that worked perfectly? The idea came to him as he observed an elderly man sitting on the sidewalk in front of the restaurant. The man, dressed simply with a distant gaze, went unnoticed by everyone entering and leaving the establishment. It was then that William had his epiphany. To truly understand what was happening in his restaurant, he would need to become invisible. The next day, William cancelled all his appointments. In his closet, he ignored the Italian suits and searched for the oldest clothes he could find. He found a faded pair of jeans and a shirt he used for workouts. At the bottom of a drawer, he discovered an old baseball cap with a worn-out logo. His transformation was completed at a thrift store downtown. He bought a tattered coat and a pair of worn-out shoes. In the dressing room mirror, he barely recognized the man staring back at him. The elegant businessman had been replaced by someone who could easily blend in with the people living on the streets. On the first night of his secret mission, William sat on a bench in the square in front of the Pinnacle. From a distance, he watched the movement of employees arriving for the night shift. He noticed how Michael, the maitre d', constantly checked his phone before entering, something the security cameras had never captured. He saw when Mrs. Clara, the longest-serving cleaning staff member, arrived limping slightly. Could it be a health issue no one had noticed? The guests began to arrive, and William carefully observed each of their expressions. He noticed that some left discreetly dissatisfied, something the satisfaction reports had never indicated. A couple argued at the entrance about the wait time, even though they had a reservation. Small details he would never have noticed from his office on the 20th floor. As the night was winding down, his attention was caught by a heated conversation coming from one of the restaurant's side windows near the emergency exit. Two women, appearing to be in their late 20s, were arguing in low but emotionally charged voices. William discreetly approached, staying in the shadows. "I can't believe he's still celebrated as a culinary genius," one of them said, her voice trembling with anger. "After everything he did to Mom." "Calm down, Megan," the other replied, placing a hand on her sister's shoulder. "One day the truth will come out. Mom deserves justice." William felt his heart race. The two women quickly walked away as a group of guests exited the restaurant, leaving him alone with his questions. Who was their mother? What had he supposedly done? That night marked only the beginning of his journey as an invisible observer of his own empire. William had no idea that his discoveries were about to shake not only his view of the restaurant, but also everything he believed about himself and his success. The next morning, William woke with a sense of unease he couldn't explain. The words of the two women echoed in his mind, mingling with fragmented memories of the Pinnacle's early years. He decided to continue his investigation, this time focusing his attention on the restaurant's kitchen. Once again dressed in his simple clothes, he positioned himself near the service entrance. The suppliers began arriving even before sunrise, and William noticed something peculiar. The chef, Richard, appeared much earlier than his official working hours. On that specific morning, he intercepted one of the suppliers before they even reached the back door. William approached stealthily. pretending to rummage through a nearby trash bin. The conversation between Richard and the supplier was whispered, but a few words reached his ears. Special delivery, discounted price, no invoice. His chef was clearly involved in some kind of off-the-books deal. As he observed the activity, an older cleaning staff member noticed him. Instead of shooing him away as William feared, she approached with a cup of coffee and a piece of bread. "You must be hungry," said Mrs. Clara with a kind smile. "I've seen you around here for a while now." The unexpected kindness caught William off guard. He accepted the coffee, and Mrs. Clara sat down beside him on the curb. "You know," she began, "I've worked here for over 10 years. I've seen a lot of things change, not always for the better." The conversation with Mrs. Clara turned out to be a valuable source of information. Between sips of coffee, she shared behind-the-scenes stories about the restaurant. She talked about employees dissatisfied with the new tipping system, the tense atmosphere in the kitchen since Chef Richard arrived, and especially how the restaurant had changed since the days of Mrs. Helen. "Mrs. Helen?" William asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Ah, the most talented sous chef this restaurant ever had," replied Mrs. Clara, her eyes gleaming with nostalgia. "She had a special gift. Every dish she created told a story. People came from far and wide just to taste her recipes. But that was before William could ask more about Helen, Mrs. Clara was called back to work. But that name stirred something in his memory. Helen Silver, now he remembered. She had worked at the Pinnacle during its early years, leaving abruptly after a heated argument. William had never known the exact details, as he was busy expanding the business at the time, and left the day-to-day management to his manager, Robert Johnson. Determined to find out more, William took advantage of a moment when the staff was distracted and managed to enter the restaurant's storage room. The place held documents and items from the establishment's early years. Among dusty boxes, he found a black-covered notebook, its pages yellowed with time. The notebook belonged to Helen. Each page revealed not only recipes but also stories, inspirations, and the creative process behind each dish. To his astonishment, William recognized the origins of several of the Pinnacle's most famous dishes for which he had been taking credit for years. The notes went beyond recipes. There were unsent letters, venting about injustices and frustrations. On one of the last pages, Helen had written about a meeting with Robert Johnson, where she was accused of trying to steal recipes from the restaurant. The accusation had led to her dismissal, and worse, her inclusion on a mysterious blacklist that prevented her from working at other renowned establishments. William felt the weight of guilt growing in his chest. The two women he had seen the night before, he now understood they were Helen's daughters. His success, which had brought him so much pride, was partially built on the unrecognized work of someone else. A noise in the hallway made him quickly stash the notebook in his coat. He left the storage room through the back, his mind buzzing with revelations. It wasn't enough to just uncover the truth. He needed to understand the full extent of the damage caused and somehow make things right. That night, as he returned to his penthouse, William couldn't sleep. The pages of Helen's notebook seemed to burn in his conscience. As he watched the city lights, he made a decision. He needed to find Helen and her daughters. But first, he had to better understand the role of Robert Johnson and the chef Richard in this story. His disguise as a beggar had become more than just an investigation. It was now a path to redemption. A week after finding Helen's notebook, William had established a routine in his new life as an invisible observer. During the day, he kept only the essential office commitments, delegating much of his responsibilities to his assistant. The nights were dedicated to the investigation, and each discovery took him deeper into the labyrinth of secrets within his own restaurant. Chef Richard began to show a suspicious pattern. 3 times a week after closing the Pinnacle, he would leave carrying a large briefcase. William followed him on one of those nights, keeping a safe distance. The chef walked a few blocks until he reached a newly opened restaurant called the Nouveau. William recognized the place. It was one of the Pinnacle's main competitors, which had been gaining prominence in culinary reviews. Hidden behind a closed newsstand, William watched as Richard entered through the back of the Nouveau. Through the illuminated windows, he could see the chef animatedly talking to someone, opening his briefcase and showing papers. The scene confirmed his suspicions. Richard was selling secrets from the Pinnacle. The next morning, William arrived early at the restaurant's storage room, determined to find more evidence. Among the boxes of old documents, he discovered financial records showing discrepancies in supplier orders. Richard was overcharging for ingredients and diverting some of them elsewhere, likely to the Nouveau. As he was reorganizing the documents, he heard voices approaching. He hid behind a tall shelf, still dressed in his beggar disguise. It was Helen's daughters, the same women he had observed days earlier. "Megan, are you sure Mom's documents are still here?" asked the younger one. "I am, Jessica. Mrs. Clara said she saw a black notebook in the storage room last week. It must be Mom's recipe notebook," replied Madison, the older one, as she rummaged through the shelves. William held his breath. The notebook was in his apartment, tucked away in his library. He watched the two sisters searching, their faces growing more frustrated with each empty drawer. "It's not here," whispered Jessica, running her hands through her hair in a nervous gesture. "How are we going to prove those dishes were her creations?" "There has to be another way," replied Madison, sitting down on a box. "We can't let that man keep taking credit for Mom's work." "Did you see how she reacted when that magazine published that article calling William Thompson the innovative genius of American gastronomy?" William felt every word like a stab. He remembered the article. It had been published 2 months ago, and he had framed a copy for his office. "The worst part wasn't that," continued Jessica, her voice choked. "It was that blacklist. Mom could never work at any top-tier restaurant in Chicago again, all because of that Robert Johnson and his lies." The sisters kept talking, revealing more details about the impact their actions and Robert's had had on Helen's life. According to them, their mother had tried to open her own restaurant, but banks denied her loans due to negative references. She ended up teaching cooking classes from her home to make ends meet. A noise in the hallway made the sisters jump. Quickly, they left the storage room, leaving William alone with the weight of their revelations. He waited a few minutes before emerging from his hiding spot, his legs trembling. That same afternoon, in his office, William began researching Robert Johnson. His former manager now worked as a consultant for several luxury restaurants, building a reputation as a culinary management expert. His social media was filled with photos from famous restaurants and industry events. A notification on his phone brought him back to reality. It was a reminder about the charity event the Pinnacle would host next month. The event would celebrate the restaurant's 15th anniversary with a special menu featuring the Pinnacle's signature dishes. Dishes that he now knew had been born from Helen's creativity. William turned off his computer and walked to the window of his office. Down below, he could see the early evening activity at the Pinnacle. Waiters coming in for their shift, the first customers arriving for dinner, the chef Richard heading out for another one of his secret meetings. His empire was built on rotten foundations, and for the first time in his life, William didn't know how to fix the situation. William's double life was starting to take its toll. During the day, he had to maintain appearances as the successful businessman, attending meetings and making important decisions. At night, he transformed into the observant beggar, gathering more and more information about the suspicious activities at the Pinnacle. His daughter Emily noticed the changes in her father's behavior. During a family lunch, she confronted him. "Dad, you've been different lately. More distant, always lost in thought. Is there something going on that we need to know about?" William brushed it off, but he knew he couldn't keep the secret much longer. The situation with Chef Richard needed to be resolved, and he still hadn't decided how to address the issue with Helen and her daughters. That night, he decided to stick to his usual routine of observation. But something felt off. Madison and Jessica, Helen's daughters, were especially aware of his presence. He saw them whispering and pointing in his direction several times. He was about to leave when Madison approached him, determined. "Hey you! Yes, you! I need to talk to you." William felt his heart race, but he kept his composure, pretending to be just a confused homeless man. Madison wasn't fooled. "For weeks now, you've been watching the restaurant. At first, we thought it was just a coincidence. But you're always here, always watching, always taking notes when you think no one's looking." Jessica joined her sister, her eyes flashing with suspicion. "Who are you? Why are you watching the Pinnacle?" William realized the moment he had long feared had arrived. He could keep lying, make up some story, but something inside him said it was time for the truth, or at least part of it. "I'm investigating some irregularities at the restaurant," he replied, deliberately keeping his voice rougher. The current chef is involved in suspicious activities. The sisters exchanged glances, surprised by the direct answer. Are you some kind of private investigator? Jessica asked. Something like that, William replied vaguely. But I've discovered much more than I expected. I found out about your mother, for example. Madison's face paled. What do you know about our mother? I know she was the true genius behind many of the Pinnacle's famous dishes. I know she was unfairly accused and barred from working in the field. I know about the recipe notebook. The notebook, Jessica exclaimed. You found it? Where is it? William hesitated. It's safe, and it could be the proof you need to clear your mother's name. Madison took a step forward, her eyes locked on William's. For a moment, he feared being recognized, but the shadows of the night and his well-crafted disguise protected him. Why are you helping us? She asked. What do you gain from this? Let's just say I have my reasons for wanting the truth to come out, replied William. But I need you to trust me. There's more going on in this restaurant than you realize. At that moment, the back door of the restaurant opened. The chef, Richard, stepped out with his usual briefcase, interrupting the conversation. William watched the sisters follow the chef with their eyes. That man over there, said William, is selling recipes and secrets to the nouveau, including some of your mother's original creations. The revelation had the intended effect. The sisters were visibly shaken by the information. How can we prove this? Asked Madison. Meet me here tomorrow night, replied William. I'll bring your mother's notebook and evidence about Chef Richard's activities, but I need you to tell me more about what happened to Helen. I need to understand the whole story. The sisters agreed, though with visible hesitation. When they left, William remained seated in the same spot, observing the restaurant's activity. His mind was racing, trying to plan his next move. The meeting with Helen's daughters had changed everything. He could no longer hide behind his disguise indefinitely. At some point, he would need to reveal his true identity. But first, he had to ensure he had all the necessary evidence, both to expose Chef Richard and to bring justice to Helen. As he walked back home, William thought about how his life had changed in just a few weeks. From a successful and respected businessman to a man tormented by guilt and secrets from the past. But for the first time in a long while, he felt he was on the right path, even if that path was painful and uncertain. The following night, William arrived early at the meeting point, carrying a folder with Helen's notebook and the evidence he had gathered about Richard. The sky over Chicago was heavy, hinting at an approaching storm, as if nature itself was in tune with the tension of the moment. Madison and Jessica arrived promptly, accompanied by a third person that made William's heart stop for a moment. Helen Silver herself. Even after 15 years, she maintained that elegant posture and determined gaze he remembered. A few grey streaks in her dark hair were the only visible sign of the passage of time. Our daughters told me about you, Helen said, stepping closer. They said you have something that belongs to me. William tried to steady the trembling in his hands as he opened the folder. He took out the recipe notebook and handed it to Helen, who held it as if it were a long-lost treasure. Where did you find this? She asked, carefully flipping through the yellowed pages. In the storage room of the Pinnacle, William replied, keeping his voice disguised. Along with some other interesting documents, he began to show the records he had gathered about Chef Richard's suspicious activities. So it's true, Madison remarked, examining the papers. The current chef is stealing recipes and selling them to the competition. Not just that, William explained. He's using your mother's original recipes, slightly modifying them, and selling them as his own creations. The nouveau is paying a small fortune for them. Helen closed the notebook firmly, her eyes blazing with indignation. First, William Thompson steals my recipes. Now this chef does the same. It seems like nothing has changed at the Pinnacle. William felt the weight of each word. About that, he began hesitantly. I found something else in the files. Something about Robert Johnson. The name of the former manager caused an immediate reaction in Helen. That man destroyed my career with his lies. I found documents, William continued, proving that Robert Johnson created a fake blacklist. He was responsible for slandering several talented employees, not just you. Apparently, he received commissions from competing restaurants to keep certain professionals out of the market. Jessica grabbed the documents, reading them eagerly. This explains why Mom could never work at another top-tier restaurant. But why didn't William Thompson ever investigate this? William felt his throat tighten. It was the moment he had feared, but he knew it was necessary. Because he was too busy counting his money and believing his own propaganda, he replied with genuine bitterness. Helen observed the supposed beggar more closely. You seem to know the inner workings of the Pinnacle very well. More than a mere observer should know. Maybe because, William began, his heart pounding, but he was interrupted by a noise coming from the back of the restaurant. The chef, Richard, rushed out, carrying not only his usual briefcase but also several bags. Seeing the group gathered, he tried to change direction, but Madison was faster. "Hey!" she shouted. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" Richard froze for a moment, then tried to run. William, momentarily forgetting his role as a beggar, moved swiftly and intercepted him. In the ensuing chaos, Richard's briefcase fell, scattering papers across the sidewalk. Jessica began gathering the documents, her eyes widening as she recognized the recipes. These are Mom's creations, all modified, but they're clearly based on her original dishes. Helen stepped closer to examine the papers, her face a mask of controlled fury. These are my recipes, my techniques, just with small changes to make them seem different. Richard, seeing himself cornered, tried to explain. I was just trying to preserve the culinary legacy of the Pinnacle. The restaurant needs to stay competitive." "Competitive?" Helen interrupted. "By using stolen recipes, selling secrets to the competition." The argument was growing increasingly heated when the headlights of a car illuminated the scene. It was a taxi stopping in front of the restaurant. From the vehicle emerged a figure William recognized immediately, Robert Johnson. The former manager had gained weight, and his hair was completely white, but his smug smile remained the same. Upon seeing the group gathered, especially Helen, his smile faltered for a moment. Well, he said, regaining his composure, "What an interesting gathering. Helen Silver in person. It's been a while." William sensed that the situation was about to explode. The past and the present were colliding in a way he hadn't anticipated. And in the midst of it all, he still had to maintain his disguise, even though he knew he would soon have to reveal his true identity. The air was thick with tension as Robert Johnson approached the group. Helen instinctively stepped forward, shielding her daughters, while Chef Richard took advantage of the distraction to try to escape again. "Stay where you are." William's voice sounded firmer than ever, even as he maintained his disguise. Richard froze in place, surprised by the natural authority of this supposed beggar. Robert looked at the scene with curiosity. "What's going on here?" "Richard, you should be preparing the special dinner for the investors at the Nouveau." The involuntary confession made Madison let out a surprised exclamation. "So you're involved in this too?" "Why am I not surprised?" "Involved in what, dear?" Robert replied with feigned innocence. "I'm just helping the Pinnacle maintain its market connections. Something your mother never understood. The importance of business relationships." Helen stepped forward, her recipe notebook clutched tightly to her chest. "Business relationships? Is that what you call destroying the careers of honest people? Creating fake blacklists?" Robert lost a bit of his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," William interjected, pulling more documents from his folder. "I have here copies of your emails to various restaurants, defaming not only Helen, but at least 5 other talented chefs. Interestingly, all of them were seen as potential threats to the Pinnacle." Jessica took the documents and began reading them aloud. "Beware of Helen Silver. She has a history of stealing recipes and selling trade secrets." The same text sent to 12 different restaurants. Robert visibly paled. This is an invasion of privacy. Who do you think you are?" William felt the moment had come. His hand slowly rose to the worn cap he was wearing. Someone who took too long to open his eyes. When he removed the cap and lifted his face to the light, the silence that followed was deafening. Helen was the first to recognize him, her eyes widening in shock. "William Thompson?" Madison and Jessica were left speechless while Richard dropped the bags he was still holding. Robert was the only one who started laughing. "So the great William Thompson finally decided to get his hands dirty. What is this? Some kind of social experiment?" "No," William replied, his voice now steady. "It's an attempt to understand what happened to my restaurant. And from what I see, you and Richard have turned the Pinnacle into a nest of conspiracies and betrayals." "You?" Madison stepped toward him, held back by Jessica. "All this time it was you watching us, pretending to be a beggar?" "Yes," William admitted. I started just wanting to understand why my restaurant seemed to have lost its soul. I ended up discovering much more than I expected. Helen watched him with a mix of emotions on her face. Why should we believe you now? After all these years? Because now I have proof, William replied, showing more documents. Proof that Robert manipulated everything from the start. He convinced you that I had stolen your recipes while telling me that you had tried to sell our secrets to competitors. We were both manipulated. This is ridiculous, Robert protested, but his voice trembled. Richard, tell them... But Richard was already too busy trying to explain the contents of the bags to two police officers who had just arrived, quietly called by Mrs. Clara, who watched everything from the restaurant door. The rain finally began to fall, first in soft drops, then in a true downpour. The group took shelter under the awning of the Pinnacle, each processing the night's revelations. 15 years, Helen murmured, flipping through her wet notebook. 15 years believing you had betrayed me. And I spent 15 years believing my success was entirely deserved, William replied. I had to become someone else to see the truth. The morning after the revelations, the Pinnacle was plunged into a tense silence. News of Chef Richard's arrest for theft and illegal sale of trade secrets spread through the team, along with rumors of Robert Johnson's involvement in old schemes. William was in his office, now dressed in his usual well-tailored suit, when his daughter Emily burst through the door waving a newspaper. Dad, have you seen this? Scandal at the Pinnacle. Chef arrested for selling culinary secrets. Why didn't you tell me what was going on? He sighed, gesturing to the chair in front of him. Emily, sit down. There's a lot more to this story than what the paper published. Over the next hour, William told his daughter everything. His disguise as a beggar, the discoveries about Helen, Robert's manipulations, and his own failures as a manager and as a person. Emily oscillated between disbelief and admiration. So those times you cancelled our lunches, she began. I was investigating, yes, he finished. I know I should have trusted you, but I needed to do this alone. I needed to see it with my own eyes. A comfortable silence settled between father and daughter. And now, Emily finally asked, what are you going to do? Before William could answer, his secretary announced over the intercom, Mr. Thompson, Helen Silver is here to see you. Helen entered the office with the same dignity William remembered. Her recipe notebook was in her hands, now protected by a plastic cover from the previous night's rain. Emily, sensing the importance of the moment, discreetly stood up. I'll let you two talk, she said, squeezing her father's shoulder as she left. Your office has changed, Helen remarked, observing the city view. More glass, less soul. Like the restaurant. William gestured for her to sit down. Helen, No, she interrupted him. Let me speak first. I spent the entire night rereading this notebook, reliving every recipe, every moment. Do you know what I realized? That even with all the anger I've felt over all these years, I never stopped creating, innovating. She opened the notebook to a specific page. See this recipe? I created it 2 years ago when Madison graduated from college. A goat cheese ravioli with acerola reduction. Do you know why I never served it anywhere? Because I was afraid that someone would steal my ideas again. William felt the weight of her words. I should have paid more attention. I should have questioned Robert, investigated his accusations. Yes, you should have, Helen agreed. But I should have fought harder too, demanded a direct confrontation with you. Instead, I let the bitterness consume me. The silence that followed was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Clara, carrying a tray with coffee and some still warm cheese breads. I thought you might need some coffee, she said with a gentle smile. These are the cheese breads from your recipe, Mrs. Helen. I've never stopped making them your way. Helen smiled, touched. You kept the recipe all these years? Of course, replied Mrs. Clara. Some things are too precious to be forgotten. After Mrs. Clara left, William stood up and walked over to his desk. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope. This is a proposal, he said, handing the envelope to Helen. It's not an attempt to buy your forgiveness, but an opportunity for us to do things the right way this time. Helen opened the envelope and began to read. Her eyebrows rose in surprise. You want to give me a partnership in the Pinnacle and the position of executive chef? With complete creative freedom and public recognition of your past contributions, William added, including a percentage on all the dishes you created over these 15 years. Helen placed the papers on the table. Why now? Because I finally understood that the pinnacle was never just mine. It was ours. Your creativity, my management. That's what made the restaurant special. Robert destroyed that with his manipulations, and I let it happen because I was too busy counting profits. Helen picked up a cheese bread and broke it in half, watching the steam rise. You know what hurt me the most all these years? It wasn't losing the job or the recognition. I lost my passion for cooking for others. I turned my kitchen into a fortress, teaching small groups, always afraid of sharing too much. And now? William asked softly. Do you still have that fear? Helen closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the aroma of coffee and cheese bread. When she opened them again, there was a different spark in her gaze. I think it's time to tear down some walls, she replied. But we have a lot of work ahead. The pinnacle needs to reclaim its soul. William smiled, realizing this was just the beginning of a long journey of reconciliation and rebuilding. The restaurant would need to be reimagined, the team restructured, trust regained. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hope. The news of William and Helen's partnership caused a stir in Chicago's culinary world. While some celebrated the return of the legendary chef, others questioned the sudden management change at the pinnacle. Madison and Jessica in particular had their reservations about their mother's decision. Are you sure about this, Mom? Madison asked during a family dinner. After everything that happened, Helen was busy testing a new recipe in her kitchen, the scent of fresh herbs filling the air. I am. Sometimes, my dear, forgiveness isn't just about forgetting the past, but about building a different future. Jessica, who was helping by chopping vegetables, paused for a moment. What about Robert? Is he just going to walk away scot-free after everything he did? Not exactly, replied Helen, a small smile on her lips. William is preparing a lawsuit against him for defamation and unethical practices. Several other chefs who were harmed have already joined the action. At the pinnacle, the transformation was beginning to take shape. William and Helen spent days reorganizing the kitchen, talking to the staff, and explaining the changes that were coming. Some employees still loyal to Richard resigned. Others, especially the more senior ones, celebrated Helen's return. Mrs. Clara became a key ally in the transition. Her knowledge of the restaurant's routine and her loyalty to both Helen and the establishment helped smooth the changes. She also had a special talent for identifying which employees were truly committed to the new project. One afternoon, while Helen was reorganizing the menu with her newly formed team, William received an unexpected visit in his office. It was the owner of the Nouveau, visibly embarrassed. Mr. Thompson, he began, I came personally to apologize. I didn't know that the recipes Richard sold us were stolen. I thought they were his own creations. William observed the man for a moment. Are you willing to make that statement officially? It would help a lot in the case against Robert Johnson. The owner nodded, eager to clear his reputation. That conversation would be another piece in the puzzle William was assembling to expose all the manipulations of his former manager. By the end of that week, Helen decided to test some new recipes with a small group of regular customers. William watched from a distance as she commanded the kitchen with the same passion he remembered from the early years of the pinnacle. She hasn't lost her touch, commented Emily, who was standing beside her father. In fact, I think she's even better. William agreed. The sparkle in Helen's eyes as she explained each dish, each technique, and each flavor combination was contagious. The entire kitchen seemed to vibrate with renewed energy. One of the dishes she served that evening was a reinterpretation of the ravioli she had created for Madison's graduation. The delicate pasta, filled with goat cheese and perfumed with fresh herbs, was topped with an acerola reduction that perfectly balanced the creamy flavor of the cheese. This dish, Helen explained to the guests, represents new beginnings. Traditional Italian pasta meets American ingredients, creating something unique. Sometimes it takes courage to mix elements that seem incompatible. The glances she and William exchanged in that moment spoke volumes. Both knew the comment went beyond gastronomy. Later that night, after the last guests had left, the team gathered for a shared meal, a tradition Helen was reintroducing at the pinnacle. As everyone shared stories and laughter, William noticed how the atmosphere had changed in just a few weeks. Madison and Jessica, who had initially resisted any involvement with the restaurant, began showing up more frequently. Madison, who had inherited her mother's culinary talent, sometimes helped in the kitchen on weekends. Jessica, with her background in business, started contributing ideas for management. "You know," Helen said to William as they shared a glass of wine after service, "when you showed up disguised as a beggar, I never imagined we'd be here just a few weeks later." William smiled. "Neither did I. But I've learned that sometimes we need to lose everything, even temporarily, to understand what truly matters." The Pinnacle was changing, evolving into something new. It was no longer just William Thompson's award-winning restaurant, nor would it simply be the stage for Helen Silver's comeback. It was becoming a place where the past and present met, where mistakes could be corrected, and where new stories could begin. The first major test of the new partnership between William and Helen came with the approach of the charity event, celebrating the Pinnacle's 15th anniversary. What was once just a commemorative party was now turning into a milestone of renewal. "We need to rethink the entire menu," Helen said during a team meeting. "I don't just want to serve the old dishes with my name on them now. I want to create something that represents who we are today." William agreed, but there were practical concerns. "Some of our main investors are nervous about all these changes. We need to prove that the Pinnacle remains a solid investment." "Why don't we turn this into our advantage?" suggested Jessica, who was now actively involved in managing the restaurant. "Instead of hiding the changes, let's celebrate them. Make the event a presentation of the new Pinnacle." The idea gained momentum. Helen began working on a special menu that told the story of the restaurant through its dishes. Each course would represent a different moment, culminating with entirely new creations that symbolized the future. Madison, who had started helping in the kitchen on weekends, surprised everyone with her natural talent. "She has the same instinct as you," William commented to Helen as they watched Madison experimenting with different ingredient combinations. "She always did," Helen replied with pride. "But before, she was too hurt to even consider a career in gastronomy. Now, well, things have changed." The preparation for the event brought unexpected challenges. Some suppliers, still loyal to Richard and Robert Johnson, tried to make life difficult for the restaurant. Late deliveries, inferior quality ingredients, inflated prices, these were constant obstacles. "We can't rely on the same suppliers anymore," Helen declared, after yet another problematic delivery. "We need to find new partners, people who believe in what we're building here." William spent days visiting small producers in the outskirts of Chicago. His experience as a beggar had taught him to look beyond appearances, to value authenticity. He found family farmers growing organic ingredients, goat breeders producing artisanal cheeses, and fishermen guaranteeing fresh fish daily. "These are the partners we need," he said to Helen after a particularly productive visit. "People who love what they do as much as we do." The team at the Pinnacle was also undergoing a transformation. Under Helen's leadership, the kitchen once again became a space for learning and creativity. She implemented a training program, sharing not just techniques but also the philosophy behind each dish. "Cooking isn't just about following recipes," she explained to the young chefs. "It's about understanding ingredients, respecting traditions, and sometimes knowing when to break them." William, on the other hand, focused on transforming the restaurant's corporate culture. Meetings now took place in the kitchen, not in conference rooms. All employees were encouraged to contribute ideas and feedback. One afternoon, while testing dishes for the event, Helen noticed something different about William. "You seem lighter," she commented, "more present." "I think I finally understand what was missing all these years," he replied. "It wasn't just about having the best restaurant or winning more awards. It was about creating something meaningful, something that made a difference in people's lives." The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Clara, who brought a surprise. She had found more old documents from the restaurant, including photos from the early days of the Pinnacle. "Look at this," she said, showing a yellowed photograph. In it, William and Helen appeared much younger, smiling, celebrating the restaurant's opening. "We were so different," Helen murmured, touching the photo carefully. "And yet some things haven't changed," William replied. "The passion for gastronomy, the desire to create something special. The difference," Helen added, "is that now we know it's better to do it together." The charity event was fast approaching, and with it grew the anticipation in Chicago's culinary world. Critics, chefs, and customers eagerly awaited to see what the partnership between William and Helen would produce. But beyond external expectations, something more important was happening inside the Pinnacle. A transformation that went beyond new menus and suppliers. It was the rediscovery of a passion, the rebirth of a dream that years ago had united two people with the same vision. The night of the charity event arrived with a special energy in the air. The Pinnacle had been completely transformed. The tables were rearranged to create a more welcoming atmosphere, and the decor blended classic elements with modern touches, reflecting the restaurant's new phase. In the kitchen, Helen was leading her team with precision and care. Madison was by her side, having decided to actively participate in the event. The young woman had discovered that her place was there, among pots and ingredients, following in her mother's footsteps. "Everyone knows their roles," Helen asked the gathered team. "Tonight isn't just a dinner, it's our chance to show who we really are." William watched the activity with a mix of pride and nervousness. In a few hours, the culinary elite of Chicago would be there, including several critics who had expressed skepticism about the changes at the restaurant. Jessica, who had taken on the event coordination, approached with her clipboard. "The first guests will start arriving in an hour. The sommelier has already paired the wines with the new menu, and the press is positioned discreetly as we agreed." The first surprise of the night came when the guests discovered there was no printed menu. Instead, each dish would be personally presented by Helen or William, who would share the story behind each creation. The first dish was a reinterpretation of the Pinnacle's original signature dish. "This dish," Helen explained to the guests, "represents our roots. But as you can see, it has evolved, just like us." The reaction was immediate. Expressions of surprise and delight spread across the room. The traditional dish had been transformed into something simultaneously familiar and innovative. Between services, William and Helen moved among the tables, chatting with the guests. They were no longer just the owner and the chef. They were partners sharing their renewed vision. "It's incredible to see the two of you working together again," commented a veteran food critic. "The Pinnacle always had something special, but now it feels complete." The most touching moment of the evening came during the presentation of the main course. Helen had created something entirely new, a dish that combined classic French techniques with typically American ingredients. "This dish," she explained, her voice filled with emotion, "is about reconciliation, about how different elements, seemingly conflicting, can create something extraordinary when they work in harmony." William understood the deeper meaning in her words. It wasn't just about food, it was about them, about the Pinnacle, about all the people who were part of that story. Near the end of the night, William asked for everyone's attention. It was time for the speech he had carefully prepared. 15 years ago, when we opened the Pinnacle, I thought I knew everything about success. I had the best facilities, the best equipment, a prime location. But over the years, especially in the last few weeks, I've learned that true success isn't in things, but in people." He paused, his eyes meeting Helen's. "The Pinnacle isn't just a restaurant. It's a shared dream, a vision that only becomes fully realized when everyone who is part of it is recognized and valued. Helen isn't just our executive chef and partner, she's the creative soul that has always made this place special." Helen, who hadn't expected the public recognition, felt her eyes fill with tears. Madison and Jessica, seated at a nearby table, held each other's hands, moved by the moment. "Starting today," William continued, "the Pinnacle is no longer just an award-winning restaurant. It's a place of transformation, of growth, of second chances. Every dish we serve tells a story, not just of ingredients and techniques, but of people, dreams, and new beginnings." The room erupted in applause. Among the guests, several other chefs who had been wronged by Robert Johnson over the years nodded in agreement, finding hope in the transformation of the Pinnacle. Later, when the last guests had left, the team gathered in the kitchen for their own celebration. Mrs. Clara poured glasses of sparkling wine for everyone, while Helen prepared a simple dish for them to share. "To the new Pinnacle," William proposed a toast. "To new beginnings," Helen added. Madison, watching her professional mentors share that moment, realized she had found her path. Jessica was jotting notes on her phone, already planning the next events. The Pinnacle had been reborn that night, not as the distant, star-studded restaurant it once was, but as a place where passion, creativity, and humanity came together. A place where second chances weren't just possible, they were celebrated. 3 months after the charity event, the Pinnacle breathed a completely different atmosphere. The changes implemented by William and Helen had transformed not only the restaurant, but also the lives of everyone involved. The first big surprise came with the publication of the reviews following the event. The top food critics in Chicago were unanimous in praising not just the food, but also the new philosophy of the establishment. "The Pinnacle has been reborn," wrote one of the most respected critics in the country. "It's not just a star-rated restaurant, but a place with soul." Madison had officially decided to pursue a culinary career. After many conversations with Helen and William, she began a structured training program in the Pinnacle's kitchen. Her presence brought a youthful and innovative energy to the team. "I never thought I'd be this happy working here," she confided to her mother during a break between services. "I always associated the Pinnacle with sadness and betrayal, but now it's like we're writing a completely new story." Jessica, in turn, had found her own place in the restaurant. Her background in administration and her keen eye for detail made her a key player in management. She worked with William to implement a new benefit system for employees, including health plans and profit sharing. "What impresses me the most," William commented during a board meeting, "is how small changes make a big difference. Employee turnover has practically vanished since we implemented the new policies." The case against Robert Johnson was progressing in court. Several other chefs and culinary professionals who had been harmed by him over the years joined the lawsuit. The blacklist he had created was exposed, and his reputation in the market was definitively ruined. One afternoon, while Helen was testing new dishes with her team, a familiar face appeared in the kitchen. It was Anna Marie, an old colleague who had also been affected by Robert's blacklist. "I came to see it with my own eyes," she said, hugging Helen. "When I heard about the changes, I could hardly believe it. The Pinnacle was the last place I expected to see justice being served." Helen invited her to join the tasting session. As they worked together, like in the old days, the two talked about the lost years and the possibilities that were now opening up. "You know," Anna Marie remarked as they sampled a new sauce, "maybe it's time for me to get back in the game too. If the Pinnacle can change so much, anything is possible." William, who was watching the scene from afar, felt a wave of satisfaction. The restaurant was becoming more than a place of culinary excellence. It was a symbol of transformation and renewal for the entire community. Emily, who had initially been apprehensive about the radical changes promoted by her father, was now one of the biggest enthusiasts of the new Pinnacle. She had started organizing special dinners that brought together young entrepreneurs to discuss ethical business practices and social responsibility. "Dad," she said during one of these events, "you've created something much bigger than a restaurant. You've created an example of how businesses can reinvent themselves without losing their essence." The most significant change, however, was in the relationship between William and Helen. Their professional partnership had evolved into a deep friendship, based on mutual respect and understanding. They complemented each other perfectly. Her creativity and passion balanced his practical sense and business vision. One day, while reviewing the seasonal menu, Helen found William staring thoughtfully out the window of his office. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how sometimes we need to get completely lost to find the right path," he replied. When I decided to disguise myself as a beggar, I was just trying to figure out what was wrong with my restaurant. I never imagined I'd end up discovering so much about myself." Helen smiled, understanding perfectly. Sometimes the universe has a funny way of correcting our mistakes. Who would have thought that after 15 years, we'd be here, working together again? Mrs. Clara, who was passing by with a tray of coffee, stopped to join the conversation. "I always knew you two would end up understanding each other. Some partnerships are just meant to work out." The sun was beginning to set over Chicago, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. In the restaurant's dining room, the first customers of the evening were starting to arrive. In the kitchen, Madison led the prep time with the same passion as her mother. Jessica, at her desk, was finalizing the details of the next charity event. The Pinnacle pulsed with renewed life, proving that sometimes second chances can be even better than the first. On the first anniversary of the new phase of the Pinnacle, a special celebration was organized. It wasn't a grand event like the charity dinner that had marked the restaurant's rebirth. It was something more intimate, more meaningful. Helen had spent the entire day in the kitchen preparing a tasting menu that told the complete story of the Pinnacle. Each dish represented a crucial moment in the restaurant's journey, From the early days filled with hope, through the years of separation, to the present moment of harmony and renewal. Madison, now a junior chef respected by the team, worked alongside her mother, adding her own touches to the classic recipes. Her creativity had flourished over the past year, and some of her dishes were already part of the restaurant's regular menu. "It's amazing how everything has changed," she commented as she finished a dessert. "I remember when I used to feel angry just walking past this place." Jessica, who was overseeing the event preparations, smiled upon hearing her sister's comment. "And now we practically live here, who would have thought?" The hall had been specially arranged for the occasion. Small round tables were set up to create a warm and intimate atmosphere. On each table, a small card told a part of the Pinnacle's story, with old and new photos side by side. William Thompson moved around the restaurant, checking every detail. His gaze stopped on a framed photo on the wall. It was him in his beggar disguise, an image discreetly captured by Mrs. Clara during those days of discovery. "I still can't believe no one recognized you," Helen Silver remarked as she approached. "Though thinking about it, maybe people only saw what they expected to see." "Like we all did," William replied. "Sometimes I wonder how much longer we would have continued in that cycle if I hadn't decided to see things from a different angle." Guests began arriving as night fell. They were people who had been part of the Pinnacle's journey. Former and current employees, suppliers who had believed in the change, critics who had documented the transformation, and even some of the chefs who had been wronged by Robert Johnson and were now finding new paths in the culinary world. Emily arrived with her boyfriend, a young chef who had started his career in the training program implemented by Helen. "Dad, look who I found at the entrance," she said, bringing Anna Marie, who now ran her own boutique restaurant. "The Pinnacle inspired me to start over," Anna Marie shared, emotional. "If Helen could overcome everything and come back even stronger, why couldn't I?" During dinner, each dish served came with a story. Helen and William took turns telling the guests the meanings behind each creation. The most touching moment came with dessert, a collaboration between Helen and Madison that represented the union of tradition and innovation. "This dish," Madison explained to the guests, "is about heritage and renewal, about honoring the past while embracing the future." Mrs. Clara, who watched everything with teary eyes, couldn't contain her smile. "I knew everything would work out one day," she commented to Jessica. "I just didn't imagine it would be so beautiful to see." At the end of the night, when only the family and the closest staff remained, William asked for everyone's attention for one last toast. "A year ago, when we decided to rebuild the Pinnacle, many thought it was a risky bet. How could we trust a partnership that had gone so wrong in the past? But we learned that sometimes it takes courage not just to change, but to admit our mistakes and try again." Helen added, "The Pinnacle today is more than a star-rated restaurant. It's a place of second chances, of renewed dreams, of people who found their way back home." Madison and Jessica approached their professional parents, forming a circle with their glasses raised. Around them, the Pinnacle team, now a true family, joined in the toast. "To the future," William proposed. "And to the flavor of new beginnings," Helen added. The Pinnacle continued to shine in the Chicago night, not just for its stars or awards, but for the light of the people who made it special. The story of William and Helen proved that sometimes you need to lose your way to find the right path, and that true success isn't just in what we achieve, but in how we choose to start over. And so, among aromas, flavors, and smiles, the Pinnacle moved forward, no longer as the dream of one person, but as the fulfillment of many. A place where the magic of gastronomy blended with the magic of second chances, proving that there's always time to write a new chapter, especially when you have the courage to start again.